Hey everyone, this is Mrs. Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us topic 8.5, which is all about eutrophication. So, we're going to start our discussion off on eutrophication by first kind of thinking back to a Unit 1 topic. When we talked about aquatic ecosystems, we talked about freshwater ecosystems like lakes and ponds, which we know are going to be stagnant forms of water. We know that they can have a multitude of layers, right, such as the littoral zone, which is the outskirts of our lake, right, the limnetic zone, profundal, and eventually the benthic zone, which is going to be the very bottom layer of that lake. Now you can see, depending upon the number of nutrients in a lake, can tell us a lot about its productivity, right? So how many different types of plants may reside there, because remember, if you think back to gross primary productivity, net primary productivity, right, that is the energy that plants can capture via photosynthesis and potentially pass it on to other organisms. So as you can see, a eutrophic lake, right, tends to have a lot of productivity. It's almost green in color, and that's usually because it's going to have the highest number of nutrients, such as nitrates and phosphates, versus mesotrophics more in the middle. Oligotrophic doesn't have quite as much. So lakes can be classified based on their levels of primary productivity. An oligotrophic lake is one that actually has very low productivity, as you can see from the picture. Not very much vegetation, right? Not quite as many fish or wildlife. Versus mesotrophic, right? That's kind of more like moderate level. Think of mesotrophic middle, right? That's kind of moderate level of productivity. We see a bit more plant life, a bit more wildlife, while eutrophic lake would have the highest level of productivity, the most vegetation, the most wildlife. And you can see over time, especially like a more eutrophic lake, that aquatic ecosystem can wind up becoming land. It can naturally undergo succession when that bottom or benthic layer of the lake accumulates enough sediment. It can wind up becoming a piece of land over time. So that sediment buildup on the benthic layer, right, leads to a lot more nutrient levels, more nitrates, more phosphates. And over time, ponds can kind of naturally shift between the oligotrophic, mesotrophic, and even eutrophic, depending upon what happens in the ecosystem. So then, what causes eutrophication? So having a lake have almost too many nutrients. So eutrophication, we know, is where a body of water is going to become very, very nutrient rich. And we know that this is because those two nutrients, nitrates, phosphates, those are limiting nutrients in aquatic ecosystems, ones that they don't normally have readily available to them very much. So when we have an extra input of nitrates and phosphates, that leads to eutrophication, excess nutrients, which is going to fuel algae growth, which is why you tend to see kind of like that green film on the surface of a eutrophic lake. Now that eutrophication can cause rapid growth of algae, and eventually that algae does die, right? Because now they're going to be occupying so much space that they're going to be trying to compete for sunlight and so on. And so we're going to most likely see some of them die, which means any microbes, any bacteria naturally found in that ecosystem will try to decompose the dead bacteria, which is going to increase biochemical oxygen demand. So then we're going to see dissolved oxygen take a big hit in this ecosystem. So here are some specific steps that happen during eutrophication. I highly recommend starring this, highlighting this. Eutrophication is a topic that comes up time and time again in our course, and I've certainly seen questions that ask you to explain how eutrophication happens. So we know when algae bloom covers the surface of water, it blocks any sunlight, right, that can kill any other plants below in the benthic layer of that lake. We said the algae eventually die off, bacteria, right, who perform decomposition, break down the algae, right, using up all the oxygen in the water, increasing the BOD, and remember that because they're using this oxygen, right, they are doing aerobic decomposition at this point. Those lower O2 levels, unfortunately, kill other species in the ecosystem, right, especially fish, right, because now if there's not quite as much dissolved oxygen, right, they're no longer in that optimal zone. Bacteria use up even more O2 to then decompose dead aquatic animals, kind of creating this positive feedback loop, pushing the system further and further to the extreme. Right? So less O2 equals more dead organisms, which equals more bacterial decomposition, which only equals less and less O2. Now, eutrophication can happen naturally, as we said in the first slide, right? Lakes can kind of flip back and forth between oligotrophic, mesotrophic, eutrophic. But what are some causes of what's known as cultural eutrophication? Cultural eutrophication is an increase in fertility in a body of water as a result of anthropogenic influence, right? So human influence of inputs. We can see the same things take place, right? Our algae bloom, decreased sunlight, right? Bacteria use up the oxygen. And when they wind up using so much of that oxygen that now it's tremendously low, we can now call that body of water a hypoxic zone, right? So that is low O2 or even a dead zone, since really no organisms are going to be able to survive in that area. Now, what kind of anthropogenic activities influence cultural eutrophication? That can be discharge from sewage treatment plants, right? If it's going to come from animal waste, human waste, soaps, detergents, all of those items tend to have very high concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus. Can also come from a manure lagoon from a CAFO. Can come from synthetic fertilizers used on an agricultural field or even on your lawn. So now that brings me to our little practice FRQ for 8.5. Here it states the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico occurs every summer when winter snow melts and spring rain flows into the Mississippi River. Recent studies have shown that both the total area covered by algae and the depth of the algae mass in the dead zone are increasing. Here it states various land use practices can have different effects on the waters that surround a dead zone. Identify the land use that covers the least amount of area in the Mississippi River watershed based on the diagram to the right, and describe one way that that land use practice at location X in the diagram could contribute to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. All right, everyone, at this point, you want to make sure that you pause the video, right? Please put down your answers for the practice FRQ and the Edpuzzle, and I recommend writing it down in your FRQ journal as well. Okay, going over some of the answers here. So remember back in the first question, right, it asked us, right, land use that covers the least amount of area in the Mississippi watershed would have wound up being urban land based on the diagram that was there. In the second, it asked you to identify some form of a practice. I'll go back for a second. It asked us to perform a practice, right, used at location X that would contribute to our dead zone. So a number of answers could be used here. The practice of fertilizer use on croplands, we know can, especially during rain events, can wash into streams and rivers, right? Carry it along the Mississippi River out to the Gulf of Mexico, causing your growth of algae. CAFOs in that specific area can generate large amounts of organic waste, right? That waste from manure lagoons can wind up in streams and rivers, and so on. Or even treated or untreated overflows in sewage in that area can also result in the same hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. All right, everyone, that's it for our video on 8.5. If you have any questions, please leave it at the end of the video.